All right. Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll start right on 1 o'clock and we'll jump into it and see who else joins us. My name is Dr. Andrew Burridge. I'm at Macquarie University and I'm in the Geography and Urban Planning department. But I also moonlight occasionally across in the MRC and work with Phil and Alice and others who are joining us here today. So very much thank you for inviting me along. Before I go any further, I'd like to just do a quick acknowledgement of country. Firstly, to acknowledge that I'm actually currently on Yuin country, but I'm speaking on behalf of Macquarie University as well, where I'm most normally based. And so I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Associate Professor Natascha Klocker, who is based at the University of Wollongong. And Natascha works at the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities and the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space, otherwise known as Access, at the University of Wollongong. She's a critical social geographer with a research and teaching focus on discrimination, marginalisation and belonging. Her recent and current research has explored the geographies and experiences of mixed ethnicity couples, the environmental and agricultural knowledge and skills of migrants, and the rural and regional settlement of former refugees. And Natascha today is presenting on understanding multicultural cities through a household lens. And we have more or less an hour. I believe Natascha needs to go just after 2 o'clock. But we'll sort of leave it to you, Natascha, for however long you wish to speak. But we'll have a Q&A at the end and of course a chance for others to speak as well. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Natascha. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. And I will just very quickly note that my internet has just dropped back a bar, so I really hope it doesn't freeze on me, so fingers crossed. Okay, so thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to present here today. And I'll also begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm speaking to you from Dharawal country. I live and work in Wollongong on the foothills of Mount Kira, or Gira, which has been an incredibly important site of education for traditional owners for millennia. And I offer my respect and thanks to elders, past and present, for caring for this beautiful place. And I also recognise that this land was never ceded. And I'll just note that what you can see behind me in my backdrop is a part of Mount Kira. So that's the place I'm talking about. So thank you for joining me today. I've been invited to give a plenary that focuses more broadly on the context of migration and multiculturalism in Australia rather than multilingualism per se. And I have to concede that as a human geographer, I feel a little bit out of place speaking at a conference on multilingualism. I'm encouraged though by recent work bringing your discipline and mine together, and particularly obviously the work of Professor Phil Benson, who's called for a spatially aware approach to multilingualism and has argued that place plays an important role in second language acquisition. Today, I'm going to ask you to think about multiculturalism at a geographical scale that's often overlooked, and that's the household. We're all familiar with aggregate level statistics. We know, for example, that nearly half of all Australians were born overseas or have at least one parent who was born overseas, and that more than 300 languages are spoken in Australian homes. We know that the composition of Australia's population has shifted, particularly with regard to the source countries of migrants. After World War II, most migrants came to Australia from Northwestern Europe, and later significant numbers came from Southern and Eastern Europe. In the 1970s, with the official adoption of multiculturalism as a policy, many migrants came from Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Cambodia. And we can see something of the extent of this shift in the graph on the right of this slide, which shows source countries of migrants to Australia between 2008 and 2018. Even in those 10 years, the UK, the yellow line on the chart, went down considerably as a proportion of Australia's migrant intake, while Southern Asia rose quite substantially. And if you combine Southern and East Asia, these regions now account for around 50% of our migration intake each year. The table on this slide, meanwhile, shows the top 10 source countries of migrants to Australia in 2019 to 20. The list was headed by India and China, and many of the other top 10 source countries were in parts of Asia, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Nepal, and Pakistan. Shifting our focus to geography, we know that this diversity plays out in different ways across our cities and regions. The vast majority of new migrants continue to settle in our largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. And within those cities, diversity certainly isn't evenly spread. That being said, research shows that Australian cities are not segregated by international standards, particularly in comparison to countries like the US. Nonetheless, distinctive ethnic residential patterns remain, and this reality at times attracts negative media and political attention. Localities that have high ethnic minority concentrations like Fairfield and Lakemba in Sydney and Dandenong in Melbourne are often cited as evidence that migrants aren't integrating or mixing with the broader population, and these sentiments fuel anti-immigration agendas. This heat map shows us something of how ethnic diversity plays out across Sydney's landscape. The red areas are those containing the highest proportion of residents with at least one overseas-born parent. And in the list to the right of the map, you can see the top 5 and bottom 5 geographical areas using this indicator. These lists likely come as no surprise to residents of Sydney, with suburbs like Auburn, Fairfield, Canterbury, Strathfield, and Burwood being known for their diversity. This next map is a little bit more complex. It was taken with permission from Alexander Tyndale's PhD thesis, and I'll tell you a bit more about Alex in a moment. So Alex used an entropy index to calculate and map the compositional diversity of different parts of Sydney by ancestry groups. So that is to say, he went beyond a question of whether people were born overseas or not, and instead looked for those localities in which multiple ethnic groups live alongside one another. The orange areas on this map, whether light orange or dark orange, are all high in diversity using this indicator. So that means they contain multiple ethnic groups in sizable numbers. The green areas are of moderate diversity, and the blue and grey areas have low diversity. So they're reasonably monoethnic, that is to say white. These types of maps that I've just shown you are highly illustrative. They use an approach often used in geographical research on ethnic diversity, and that is counts of individuals in places. And this can help shed light on the degree to which individuals of different ethnicities share residential areas. But counts of individuals can't illuminate the extent to which ethnic mixing occurs within the intimate sphere of the home. Now, I concede this is an overly simplistic sketch that I've prepared here, but let's imagine for a moment that suburb A and suburb B have an identical ethnic composition, 2/3 white, 1/3 not white. But if we zoom in a little closer to the household scale, we see something different going on. In suburb A, various ethnic groups live largely separate lives. But in suburb B, we see people from those different ethnic backgrounds living together and married to one another even. Zooming in this way offers important additional insights into ethnic mixing in our cities. And I hope that the household scale might be of interest to attendees at this conference, given mixed ethnicity households provide fertile ground for multilingualism. If we focus on ethnic mixing at the household scale, we see a different geography of ethnic diversity playing out across our cities. In Sydney, for example, the suburbs with the highest proportion of mixed ethnicity couples aren't those with the highest level of diversity overall. And this is shown in these two comparative maps. The one on the right is the one I showed you a moment ago, mapping individual level diversity across Sydney, which is most pronounced in the west and southwest. The map on the left shows in the darker shades the local government areas with the highest proportions of mixed ethnicity couples. That is, those places where there is the greatest ethnic mixing at the household scale. These are mostly in the inner city and surrounding areas, including North Sydney, Mossman, Chatswood, Leichhardt, Marrickville, Petersham, and Sydenham. The rest of my talk today is split into two parts. In the first, I'll present quantitative data on ethnic diversity that shows us the value of focusing on the household scale. And in that section, I'm very heavily indebted to my colleague, Dr. Alexander Tyndale, who I mentioned a moment ago. Our research on mixed ethnicity couples was very much a collaborative effort, and Alex unequivocally led the quantitative and mapping component of that work, because those are skills that I definitely don't possess. Those analyses were based on customised census data from the 2011 Australian census, which enabled Alex to, for the first time in Australia, map the nationwide residential distribution of mixed ethnicity couples. Though today I'll mostly focus on Sydney. In the second part of my talk, I'll report on qualitative research, which is much more in my wheelhouse, and that explored how mixed ethnicity couples experience place, and in turn, how those experiences might tell us something about Australian multiculturalism. The end point of everything that I discussed today is that I hope to show you that we can't understand multicultural Australia in the present day without turning inwards to focus on the household scale. So let's start part one. Mixed ethnicity couples have garnered a lot of research attention as a signifier of the declining social distance between ethnic groups and as a mechanism for breaking down ethnic exclusiveness. The American sociologist Emery Bogardus made such assertions as early as 1933. Studies have quantified the growing presence of mixed ethnicity couples in countries of high immigration, including the USA, Canada, UK, and Australia. The growing prevalence of mixed ethnicity couples occurs because migrants become more likely to partner outside of their own ethnic group with each successive immigrant generation. For example, Walker and Hurd found that in 2011, 88% and 84% of first-generation Lebanese migrant males and females living in Australia had a Lebanese partner. Those rates fell dramatically to 32% and 25% for third-plus generation migrants, and they documented similar patterns for other groups. Notably, rates of outmarriage are also high for Indigenous Australians, not just immigrants. In 2011, 57% and 59% of partnered Indigenous men and women, respectively, had a non-Indigenous partner. Geographers have turned their attention to what all of this means for spatial patterns of ethnic diversity. International research has established that mixed ethnicity couples have unique geographies and don't simply reinforce existing ethnic residential concentrations. And I gave a hint of that in the maps that I showed you a moment ago. For instance, the spatial distribution of Black-white couples in the USA doesn't neatly align with either the broader Black or white populations. Wright and colleagues described an in-between pattern. Mixed white non-white couples in the USA typically live in more diverse neighbourhoods than white couples, but less diverse neighbourhoods than non-white couples. And they concluded on this basis that these couples are agents of change who can, over time, reduce residential segregation. Our research showed that this is also the case in Australian cities, but before discussing those findings, I just need to explain a bit more of what our analysis focused on. So we focused on a very specific subset of mixed ethnicity couples, those involving one Anglo-European partner, so a person from Australia's white ethnic majority group, and one partner from a visible minority group. We made this choice because the social and cultural significance of mixed ethnicity relationships varies according to the partner's respective ethnicities. And existing research has shown that visibly different couples are more likely to experience discrimination in their everyday lives and as a factor shaping their residential decisions. Or to put it more bluntly, a couple involving an Anglo-Celtic Australian partner and a German partner, for example, doesn't attract the same kind of attention in public as a couple involving an Anglo-Australian partner and a Black African partner. Because we needed groups of a sufficient size to enable statistical analysis, we ultimately focused on couples in which one partner was Anglo-European and the other partner's ancestry fell into one of these 6 broad regional categories: Pacific Islander, North African and Middle Eastern, Southern and Central Asian, Sub-Saharan African, Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian. We additionally requested customized census data for 5 finer-grained country-level groups with sufficient populations in Australia to enable statistical analysis. And they were Chinese, Filipino, Lebanese, Indian, and Vietnamese. Broadly speaking then, our analyses compared the residential geographies of visibly different mixed ethnicity couples against the residential geographies of co-ethnic couples in which both partners share the same ethnicity. We included all cohabiting couples, both same sex and opposite sex. And we were able to show that mixed ethnicity partnerships contribute to greater residential dispersal. And the flip side of this, less ethnic residential concentration. But in the interest of time, I can only give you a couple of illustrative examples of that today. So we can see in these maps how the residential geographies of mixed ethnicity couples differ from those of co-ethnically partnered couples. And I'll show you this and then 2 other examples from Sydney as well. Now, these maps were calculated using location quotients, which depict the concentration of mixed ethnicity couples in each area relative to the metropolitan average. The darker shaded areas signify places of higher concentration, and the lighter ones obviously lower concentration. In this first example, we're comparing the geographies of co-ethnic Northeast Asian couples on the left with the geographies of mixed ethnicity couples involving one Anglo-European partner and one partner of Northeast Asian ancestry on the right. Now, as you can see from the preponderance of darker areas in the map on the left, co-ethnic Northeast Asian couples are more likely to be concentrated in suburbs to the west, southwest, and northwest of the inner city. Meanwhile, those with Anglo-European partners are less concentrated overall. We see this because there are fewer areas that are shaded dark. These mixed ethnicity couples have dispersed towards the inner city and surrounding suburbs, and so their geographies are not restricted to areas with large Northeast Asian populations. Without going into such detail, we can see a similar pattern of reduced concentration and increased dispersal into different parts of the city for mixed ethnicity couples involving an Anglo-European partner and a North African or Middle Eastern partner, as you can see on this slide. And the same goes for couples involving an Anglo-European partner and a South and Central Asian partner, as you can see here. Now, this table offers another way of exploring this pattern of deconcentration or dispersal. And I'll just use one illustrative example so that we don't get bogged down. In the highlighted section, you can see that in Sydney in 2011, 62.8% of couples involving 2 Lebanese partners lived in areas with high concentrations of Lebanese people. Far fewer couples involving 1 Anglo-European partner and 1 Lebanese partner lived in such areas, only 28.3%. There was a similar pattern in Melbourne. This mirrors what most international studies have shown, that people in mixed ethnicity partnerships are more geographically dispersed than those in co-ethnic partnerships. This pattern was consistent for all of the mixed ethnicity couple types we considered and across cities including Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. This in-betweenness may arise from a preference for these couples to live in neighbourhoods that are more tolerant or accepting of ethnic mixing, and so are not dominated by one ethnic group or another. Living in areas with a moderate level of neighbourhood diversity may reduce fears of discrimination, and this can be particularly important for mixed ethnicity couples with children. The upshot of all of this is that as mixed ethnicity households continue to become more common in Australia, they will likely play a key role in reconfiguring the geographies of ethnic diversity in our cities and regions. Ethnic minority people with Anglo-European partners are far more likely to live outside zones of the city with high concentrations of their own ethnic minority group. In the opposite direction, Anglo-Europeans who are in mixed ethnicity partnerships have an elevated propensity to live in areas with larger ethnic minority populations. That is to say, they're less likely to live in predominantly white neighbourhoods. These patterns pull against ethnic residential concentration. And so the preponderance of evidence indicates that mixed ethnicity couples will, over time, contribute to more diffuse urban ethnic geographies. And so they hold great potential to disrupt seemingly established ethnic geographies in Australian cities. So now to part 2, it's time to shift gear to the qualitative component of the project, which is probably a relief for people who are feeling some statistical overload by this stage. So Alex and I not only wanted to map the geographies of mixed ethnicity couples in Australia, we also wanted to understand how mixed ethnicity couples experience the places where they live. Research, primarily from the US, has shown that place fundamentally shapes the lives of mixed ethnicity couples. At the most basic level, life inside and outside the home are distinctive experiences. Many mixed ethnicity couples report rarely thinking about or identifying with their ethnic differences when they're alone or with their children. Yet when they leave their homes, they're frequently reminded of their mixedness by stares, questions, and comments. Whether well-intended or deliberately hostile, these experiences make visibly different families feel on display. Place also matters to mixed ethnicity families because racism varies geographically. And so their experiences of discrimination or acceptance will vary according to things like neighbourhood ethnic composition, socioeconomic status, and the prevalence of conservative or progressive social attitudes in an area. And an interesting side note on that point regarding progressive social attitudes, the areas with the highest proportions of mixed ethnicity couples in Sydney are also areas with the highest proportions of LGBTQ residents. Keen to explore how these experiences play out in Australia, Alex and I spent 4 years interviewing visibly different mixed ethnicity couples in 2 Australian cities, Sydney and Darwin. We chose them because the quantitative analysis showed that they have the highest proportion of visibly different mixed ethnicity households of any Australian cities. We conducted 48 interviews with 86 adult members of mixed ethnicity households, and all couples involved one white partner and one partner from an ethnic minority background. Yet there was a great deal of diversity within this ethnic minority group, as you can see on this slide. Participants were asked to discuss where and how they'd met, and their family members and friends' reactions to their relationships. We also asked them to detail their experiences of living in various neighbourhoods as a mixed ethnicity family, and about their broader geographies in Sydney and Darwin, and when travelling in other parts of Australia or overseas. We were attentive to participants' place-based narratives of comfort and discomfort, including their exposure to racism. When presenting participant quotes in the rest of my talk today, I use pseudonyms for those who requested them, and I refer to all participants using their self-defined ethnicities, which are on this slide. Before I get into the qualitative empirical evidence that we gathered, I'll briefly discuss my own positionality in relation to this research, and then some of the history of mixed ethnicity relationships in Australia, because those historical experiences form the backdrop against which we need to understand the present day. So I'm part of a visibly different mixed ethnicity family. I consider myself Anglo-European Australian, but my parents are Austrian and I was born there. We migrated to Australia when I was a baby. My husband is from Tanzania in East Africa. We met while I was in Tanzania conducting research for my PhD. We have 2 mixed ethnicity daughters aged 7 and 12. And as a family, we've spent time living in different parts of Australia. Richmond, a diverse inner suburb of Melbourne, Cronulla, a monocultural white suburb in Sydney's south, and now Wollongong, a university city which is more diverse than Cronulla, but less so than Richmond. With this in mind, we've had a fair bit of personal insight into the ways in which place shapes the experiences of mixed ethnicity families. Now, before I transition to the next slide, I do just want to share a caution that it contains an image of an Aboriginal person who may since have passed away. The stories that Alex and I were told over the course of our interviews were in many ways remarkable. I say this because few of the mixed ethnicity couples we spoke to had experienced any overt hostility as a result of their relationships. I find this remarkable because just a couple of generations ago, Australian families fell apart when two white Christians married each other, if one happened to be Protestant and the other Catholic. It's also remarkable because up until the mid-1900s, an Australian woman could be stripped of her own citizenship if she had a non-European husband. And because as recently as 1959, the Director of Aboriginal Welfare in the Northern Territory denied Gladys Namagu permission to marry her white fiancé, a drover by the name of Mick Daly. That decision, which was subsequently overturned upon appeal, as you can see in these images, had many historical precedents under a protectorate system and Aboriginal welfare boards which refused Indigenous Australians the dignity and freedom of choosing marriage partners without written permission. The stories that Alex and I were told are remarkable too, because as late as 1986, a kissing scene involving an Indigenous woman and a non-Indigenous man scripted for the television drama The Flying Doctors was cut by the network for offending public sensibilities. It was almost a decade later in 1994 that the first such kiss made it to air in the ABC miniseries Heartland, featuring Cate Blanchett and Ernie Dingo. Set against this backdrop, our study participants' accounts provide cause for optimism. They show that times have changed. Amongst the couples we spoke to, accounts of direct racism, of violence, harassment, intentionally disparaging remarks, of discrimination in the workplace or housing market, and even of familial rejection were rare. Outright enmity and disgust towards mixed ethnicity relationships have mostly given way to curiosity and some remaining problematic stereotypes, which I'll discuss in a moment. Alex and I were told some alarming stories, but I don't want to suggest that they were the majority for couples involved in this study, and to suggest that those types of experiences are the majority would be disingenuous. The overarching finding that stood out from our interviews was that individuals who are in mixed ethnicity relationships experience place differently, depending on whether they're together or apart. That is, depending on whether they're out and about in the world alone or with their visibly different partner or children. And I'll explore this through two key themes. The first theme is invisibility and hypervisibility. Stares are a common occurrence for mixed ethnicity couples, and existing studies have reflected this. Now, our focus was more specific. We wanted to understand how family members' feelings of visibility or invisibility shift in different configurations. Our interviews showed that the shift between invisibility and hypervisibility was particularly pronounced for white interviewees. When alone, they're able to move about public space in various parts of Australia without being commented upon or even noticed. This sense of invisibility slips away alongside visibly different family members, as explained by Zoe, a European Australian mother of 2 young children with her husband Romano, who is Ratuman. When alone, Zoe said, "I feel like no one bats an eyelid. I'm the norm. There's nothing interesting here." "It's silly, isn't it?" she laughed. "Your experience is completely different with your family as opposed to if you're on your own. You're in your 30s, you've probably got a couple of kids at home. Oh yeah, that lady, I didn't even notice." Catherine, who described herself as Anglo-New Zealander and whose husband is also Ratuman, had a similar experience. When out and about with her husband and children, she notices people's looks and feels uncomfortable, more on guard and on show. When alone, her experience is of merging in with the crowd and blending in. Matt, who described himself as a white Australian, provided a very detailed account of how his experience of place shifts depending on whether he's alone or with his Chinese wife, Shichi. He narrated quite a complex geography. When alone anywhere in Sydney, Matt feels that he goes under the radar. But if he's with Shichi in either predominantly white areas or predominantly Asian areas of the city, he feels his radar come on. And he knows that as soon as they hold hands, people are going to notice. Similarly, Matthew, who described himself as Australian, explained that when he visits places like Camden alone or with his white father, he feels pretty chilled and goes unnoticed. Now, Camden, for anyone who doesn't know, is a predominantly white suburb in Sydney's southwest. When in the same place with his fiancée Tiffany, who is Australian with Sri Lankan parents, Matthew notices open staring and visible disapproval. Sorry, I missed that one. There we go. One couple, Dinesh and Juliet, recounted dramatic experiences of being in public together while living in a regional Australian town in the 1990s. Dinesh is Sri Lankan and Juliet is white Australian. Juliet recalled, "We'd be walking down the street holding hands and people would look at us like we had leprosy." Dinesh explained that it was challenging enough being a person of his skin colour in that town at that time, but being in public with Juliet made his life manifestly harder. "I had enough problems as it is just being ethnic," he said. "Dating a white girl was like putting salt into a wound." It got so bad, Dinesh said, that he couldn't leave his home on Australia Day. "These fellows with utes with the Australian flag would slow down and tell me to go back to where I'd come from." Things were worse when Juliet was next to him. They'd say, "What are you doing with a white girl?" The sense of surveillance and judgment that Dinesh and Juliet experienced made them feel unsafe. Their encounters with strangers in public places became problematic and potentially dangerous through the combination of their visibly different bodies side by side. Happily, I can report that they later moved to Darwin, where things improved. And Dinesh said, "We're not the lowest common denominator up here. I feel really comfortable." Hypervisibility also comes through the presence of mixed ethnicity children. Ben, who is Nigerian, has noticed a marked increase in the stares he experiences when he's in public with his daughter, largely because her hair attracts people's attention. My husband, Paul, who's Tanzanian, made similar observations. I asked him to rate his visibility in different familial configurations along a continuum. He explained that when he's alone in public, he would rate the amount of attention he receives as a 3 out of 10. With me alongside him, that goes up to 5 or 6 out of 10. But when he's with our daughters, his sense of being stared at is full blown, 10 out of 10, he said. "There's always people looking or commenting." In many instances, the attention directed towards mixed ethnicity children is well-intended and friendly, but it nonetheless generates a completely different experience of place and serves as a reminder that visibly different families are not yet the norm. So now to the second key theme that emerged from the interviews, individual and intercorporeal stereotypes. As I talk through this theme, the role of language does come up from time to time, which makes me feel a little bit less like an interloper at this conference. So what do we mean by individual and intercorporeal stereotypes? Well, our interviews with mixed ethnicity couples showed that privilege and marginality are lived relationally. That is to say, each partner's body becomes marked or racialized differently through the proximity or absence of their loved ones. People who are in mixed ethnicity relationships experience different sets of stereotypes when they're alone, when they are with their visibly different partner in public, and when they are out with their children. I'll start now with the individual stereotypes that people experience in public when they're alone. These were only really a matter for ethnic minority interviewees who described feeling judged according to 4 key labels when in public alone: outsider, poor, non-English speaking, and criminal. The interesting thing for the purposes of our analysis is that some of these stereotypes dropped away completely when they were with their white partner. When shopping by herself, Samantha, who is Anglo-Indian, is treated as an outsider. People act as though she can't speak English. "They talk to me like I don't understand things," she said. But when her Anglo-Australian husband Ben is with her, this experience changes. Ben feels that his presence makes retail staff realize Samantha is, in his words, not fresh off the boat. Meanwhile, as a young Japanese woman, Momoko feels perceived as a tourist when she's alone in her predominantly white Sydney suburb Freshwater. Alongside her white Australian husband, Eric, she feels more confident and comfortable, like a resident. The ethnic minority participants in our study also described feeling looked down upon as being of lower class or status when in public alone. My husband, Paul, has noticed better service in shops when I'm with him, which he attributes to staff members' assumption when he's alone that he can't afford to pay. Annette also described receiving improved service in high-end shops when with her white husband, Paul. Alone, Annette feels stereotyped as an Asian tourist. Asian tourists get treated not particularly nicely, she told us. If you're with white people, she continued, retail staff seem to have a different customer approach. And Carlos from Colombia prefers to avoid browsing in shops in Sydney suburbs like Paddington or Woollahra unless his Anglo-Australian partner Rachel is with him. In his words, Rachel qualifies him as being okay in that place. Our ethnic minority research participants also described having their English language competency questioned when alone. Romano's colleagues in the construction industry initially assumed he could not read English. Upon realising that his wife Zoe is not only Australian but a white Australian lawyer, their perceptions shifted. Meanwhile, Paul has noticed that when he's out and about without me, people seem hesitant to start up a conversation. They don't know how to interact with me, he said, just in case I don't speak fluent English. Paul addresses this misperception by audibly conversing with our daughters in English when they're out together, for example, at the playground. This makes other parents realise that they can start a conversation with him. Paul is also reluctant to use his first language, Swahili, when in public alone. Even if he's on the phone with a Tanzanian friend, if he's in public, he will speak English to convey to those around him his belonging in Australia. When I'm with him, he feels this performance is unnecessary. More specifically, Paul feels comfortable speaking Swahili with me in public because, in his words, you're white, so people just look at you and go, shit, she can actually speak African. All of a sudden, it's got a different effect on people. I feel like people are not judging me because I'm speaking to you. All of a sudden, it's cool, I can speak Swahili because I'm talking to my wife and she's white. A final set of individual stereotypes that came out strongly in our interviews was criminality. In his 30s, with a strong build and cultural tattoos from Rotuma, Romano explained, people judge you by your looks. They assume you're going to rob them. When shopping alone, he's noticed heightened security surveillance, which doesn't happen when accompanied by his white wife, Zoe. In a different example, Annette explained that her luggage is regularly searched at the airport when she travels alone, but not when her husband Sean is there. If you're coming back from an Asian country and you're Asian looking, she explained, they stereotype or racially profile you. They think that you're going to bring in something that you shouldn't be bringing in. When she's with Sean, however, her bags don't get searched. For an extreme example of how stereotypes of criminality slip and slide, we return to Dinesh, who is Sri Lankan. He compared going through Australian airport customs alone and in different familial configurations. Dinesh explained, if I'm going through customs in the airport on my own, there's always a cavity check, bomb threat detection, everything. Being with his wife, Juliet, doesn't change the reaction a great deal, but if he's there with Juliet and their daughter, it's all good. With his wife and daughter, Dinesh is seen as a family man. Alone, he is a potential terrorist. The examples I've discussed so far signal that being alongside white family members can enable ethnic minority people to access certain privileges in Australia and to escape some of the stereotypes they typically face as individuals. And now, while this sounds like good news, there is a catch. When mixed ethnicity couples are in public together, a whole new set of stereotypes comes to the fore, and we refer to these as intercorporeal stereotypes. It appeared in our interviews that the people most exposed to these stereotypes are women of Asian ancestry who are in mixed ethnicity relationships with white men. Steve describes himself as Anglo-Saxon. He's married to Fung, who is Chinese Balinese. Steve explained, you can see people's minds working. There's an older bloke, she's probably from the Philippines. She's probably a mail order bride. Wulan, who is Indonesian, explained in great detail that she feels very differently when walking around Darwin alone or with her white Australian husband, Grant. When walking alone, Wulan said she can avoid being seen as that kind of woman because she's not walking with a white guy. When she walks with her husband, Wulan feels judged, and so she dresses carefully to mitigate these assumptions. Every time we go out, she explained, I always make sure to look proper. To her mind, this means checking that her dress is not too short, to make sure that no one will see me like that. Assumptions that she is that kind of woman, or a gold digger, to use Grant's words, upset Wulan. They run counter to her identity as an educated, professional woman in a loving marriage. Dressing in a particular way enables her to reassert some control over her public identity. Another strategy used by some participants relates to language. Living on Sydney's mostly white northern beaches, Momoko, who is Japanese, is careful to practice her English and works on reducing her accent. If she can speak English well, she reasons, people will be less likely to assume that her relationship with Eric is fake or just a physical thing. If we can both speak with one another with English, it looks like it's not so strange. It must be a more legitimate relationship, she said. Other sets of intercorporeal stereotypes are experienced by women in mixed ethnicity relationships when alone in public with their children. When women are darker skinned compared to their children, there is an assumption that they are the child's nanny. On the flip side, white women with mixed ethnicity children are often framed as the adoptive mother. Zoe, who is European Australian, has often noticed that she tries to attenuate the stereotypes that surround her when she's out and about with her young children. And she said, I explain my children a lot because I see the curiosity. And so I'll immediately say, oh, daddy's Polynesian or something like that. Explaining her family in this way, Zoe said, helps to diffuse the curiosity in the air, and then people become more amenable. Zoe's propensity to explain her family situation stems from a feeling that people are looking down on her when she's out with her children, but without Romano. She described feeling an unspoken judgment that is really awful. As a white mother of mixed ethnicity children, she senses that people make assumptions that she is a not very classy single mother. People look at me and they're not smiling, she said. When in public with her children, Zoe goes out of her way to make herself look respectable to counter such stereotypes. The baggage that's carried by visibly different couples is unique. On the one hand, these stereotypes are persistent. The Asian mail-order bride is a case in point. They're embedded in Australian culture and show no sign of making a quiet exit anytime soon. On the other hand, these stereotypes are fickle. And I say this because the public gaze settles on visibly different couples differently depending on where they are. A neighbourhood's ethnic composition, its socioeconomic status, and its mix of conservative or progressive attitudes all play into couples' everyday experiences. The public gaze also settles on mixed ethnicity families differently when they are in different configurations. Stereotypes adhere or slide off through the presence or absence of loved ones. Alone, a young woman of Asian ancestry might be cast as a tourist, international student, or migrant in the public imagination. Accompanied by her white husband, especially if he's older or if he looks older, other labels surface: mail-order bride, gold digger, visa seeker, and prostitute. Alone with her mixed ethnicity children, especially if they're of pale complexion, the stereotypes shift once again: nanny, carer, or maid. It'd be fair to say then that people who are in mixed ethnicity relationships pick up certain sets of baggage and put down others depending on where they are and who they are with. And such couples then are ideally placed to gauge the persistence or capriciousness of common stereotypes, and in so doing to turn a mirror on the societies in which they live. Notably, when visibly different nuclear family units are in public together, the stares don't fade away, they're still hypervisible, but the questions do decrease. Alongside one another, mothers, fathers, and children make sense to others. As Fung, who is Chinese Balinese with an Anglo-Australian husband, explained, mum and dad and the kids answer the story. The presence of a mixed ethnicity family unit together also unsettles many of the problematic stereotypes I've just discussed. When family units are together, white mothers are not asked about adoption. Equally, ethnic minority women no longer feel like the nanny. White mothers feel less judged along class lines, and ethnic minority women feel less judged as mail-order brides or gold diggers. As Fung and Steve explained, having children around eliminates assumptions and legitimizes mixed ethnicity relationships in the public eye. I'll return for a moment to Dinesh, who experiences a dramatic shift when in public with his wife Juliet and their daughter. For him, being seen as a family man helps to correct many misconceptions about his identity and character, eliminating assumptions that he is, in his words, a low-skilled migrant worker, a former detainee, or someone who is trying to deceive immigration to get a visa. Drawing these qualitative and quantitative threads together, I argue that a focus on mixed ethnicity couples tells us important things about how Australian society has changed. That is to say, their increased prevalence and limited experiences of overt hostility show us that enormous but unfinished strides have been made towards greater acceptance of diversity. This is shown in these closing words from Matthew and Tiffany, a young couple from Campbelltown. But mixed ethnicity couples' experiences of stereotyping and judgment alert us to the fact that there remains work to be done in eliminating harmful and enduring stereotypes, perhaps most particularly in regard to women from Asian backgrounds who truly bore the brunt of many of the challenges we heard about during our study. So mixed ethnicity couples tell us something about how society is changing, but equally they are agents of change. They are changing society through their growing prevalence. These couples are changing the ethnic composition of Australian society by having mixed ethnicity children. They potentially expose their broader family and friendship groups to diversity in a way that breaks down barriers. And as shown in this paper, they are shifting established ethnic residential geographies. By pulling against ethnic residential concentration, mixed ethnicity families contribute to greater spatial mixing between diverse groups. The take-home message of this body of work and of my paper today then is that scholarly engagements with ethnic diversity need to become more attuned to the household scale, and that a focus on the individual as the primary unit of analysis is no longer sufficient to understand Australian multiculturalism. So that's where I will leave it, and I'm happy to take some questions if there are any, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Natascha. And of course, if everyone wants to join with a digital or otherwise a round of applause, thank you so much. I'm going to just hand it over to the floor to open up to questions, and I'll do as a light touch chairing as possible. But please, if you want to just jump in or put your hand up, I'll hopefully see, but maybe best just to jump in. Of course, you can pop a question in the chat if you'd like. First hand I see up is Matt, so I'll hand over to you, Matt. And you're on mute. There we go.
Thanks, Andrew. Natascha, absolutely fabulous work. Fascinating. I was on the edge of my seat, which is unusual for keynotes at conferences. What came to mind immediately? We know that you know, from sociolinguistics, we know that there are gender effects in terms of how languages sort of work. And I wondered if there were any gender sort of differences in the couples, whether, you know, whether you picked up in your research if it was, you know, an Anglo male or an Anglo woman, whether that had any sort of differences.
In terms of the quantitative part of the study, I wouldn't be able to recall off the top of my head how the numbers exactly played out. So I'd have to look back into the papers for that. But in terms of the qualitative data, certainly men just faced a lot fewer stereotypes. So regardless of if the man was white, he didn't face stereotypes for or negative attitudes for having children of a mixed ethnicity, you know, or didn't face the same types of judgments for having a partner who was from an ethnic minority background. And equally, the white men that we interviewed mostly just seemed to have this base level of privilege that was really hard to rattle, if I can put it like that. Like, didn't particularly care or notice or were not that concerned about attention they received. So that was certainly something that we noticed. We noticed that that women across the board seem to bear the brunt of more of the stereotyping in both directions, whether white women being perceived as being not very classy, like Zoe said, because she had a partner who was not white, or in particular, as I mentioned, Asian women facing really the biggest brunt of really problematic stereotypes. So definitely a gender effect in terms of experience. There was one story of a man, though, that always stays with me, and it's Steve, who came up a couple of times in what I was just saying, and he goes yachting a lot with his late teenage, early adult children at the time when we were interviewing him, and he had to start every time they stopped their boat somewhere and went ashore to a small resort or something, he would always be at pains to say repeatedly, my daughter and I, or my son and I, because everybody thought that he was an older guy who had brought teenage children with him and was involved with them. So he faced this stereotype where he was being perceived as being a bit creepy when he was taking his children somewhere, because people didn't automatically connect that they were his children. But other than him, most of the examples were that men really didn't face a great deal of drama, the white men. And for men of ethnic minority background, a lot of stereotypes when they were alone. So whether it's criminality or all of those sorts of things, but once they were with their partner, that kind of dropped away. So they didn't face the additional baggage of different stereotypes through the proximity of their partner. So I hope that helps a bit.
No mail order husbands.
There was one man who joked about it in Darwin, but no, not really.
Fabulous. Thanks very much again.
No worries.
Great.
Thank you, Matt. And I see Phil's got his hand up, so over to you, Phil.
So somebody had their hand up before me.
Oh, and yeah, if I've missed anyone, I can't see any hands, but if someone else has,
put it down again,
please let me know or pop it in the chat.
Okay,
go for it.
Thanks, Natascha. That was really amazingly interesting, and I think one of the connection you have is that probably so many people who are interested in multilingualism have experience of or are in mixed ethnicity partnerships of different kinds, and that's one of the reasons why people get interested in multilingualism, I guess. I just wanted to take you back, if I could, to the census, to Andrew Tyndale's census stuff, because the procedure he's using, I suspect, is very similar, although I don't understand the procedure at all. I suspect it's very similar to what Jim Forrest has been doing here. He has an entropy procedure for in a few publications recently that have identified language, that have looked at language concentrations, and I suspect that the areas where the same ethnicity couples are mostly found are probably the areas where the corresponding languages are more concentrated. But what I wanted to ask you is so essentially it looks like people in mixed ethnicity couples tend to be in the inner city, right? Is that right?
Yeah, and surrounding areas. Yep.
Whereas the same ethnicity couples tend to be in the sort of traditional multicultural, if you like, areas of Siminsa. So is the suggestion, is it that they are making a choice about where they live based on the fact that they are mixed ethnicity couples? So they're actually choosing to move to the inner city? Because what's in my mind is it's kind of more expensive to live in the inner city. So I'm wondering whether they're choosing to do that, or whether they're kind of, or whether it's to do with the sort of social relationships in those particular areas where they live already.
Okay. So yeah, so there are a few things going on. So in terms of income, certainly being able to live in the inner city is prohibitively expensive for many people. And in the analysis, when we controlled for income and so on, so looking at socioeconomic status of households, we found that there was an effect, but that it didn't fully account for the residential decisions being made by couples. What was interesting, though, was that we specifically asked couples to to explain their residential choices. So to talk about why they were choosing to live where they lived. And although we saw this shift in the quantitative sense towards these kind of in-between localities that are more mixed overall rather than having high proportions of any specific group, in the interviews, people actually didn't use that as their reason for making their choices about where to live. Often it came down to things like location of family. So in particular, where they might be trying to live closer to where family members of the white partner live, because often the family members of the other partner might not be in Australia. So in some cases, that was a mechanism that caused people's geographies, I guess, to tend towards particular areas. Often it was work. So, so there is potentially a factor at play in terms of the types of jobs that people were doing that was driving residential decisions. But it was really interesting because when we analysed the interview data, we were fully expecting that one of the main things that we would find would be that people were making their decisions to live in particular places to avoid discrimination. That hardly featured in their discussion at all. So there's a far more complex array of things going on that are driving residential decision making, not just being in a mixed ethnicity family, which is quite different to what came out in US-based studies. And I think that's probably, and you mentioned Jim Forrest earlier, and he was involved in the early days of advising Alex during his honours thesis, which then led into the PhD. And his work is the work I was referring to earlier on in my talk, that has really shown that Australia isn't segregated along ethnic lines, residentially speaking, in the same way as the US. So I think those types of decision-making factors play a much more significant role in really segregated societies than they do potentially in Sydney. So we were quite surprised that it didn't emerge as the #1 factor that people use to decide where to live.
All right. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Phil. So we've got a couple more minutes. If there's any other questions that anyone else would like to ask Natascha before we wrap up, probably take 1 or 2 more questions. Perhaps we've exhausted the questions for them. Well, we're approaching 2 o'clock. I know Natascha needs to get going pretty much at 2. So if no further questions, I'm just leaving it open here. If there's anything else anyone wants to jump in. All right, well, if you could all join me in thanking Natascha for a wonderful keynote this afternoon. I'm a bit biased, but I always love to see geographers proving that we can speak outside the discipline as well, and the value of our work and how it crosses over. So it's a good plug for geography there as well. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again to Natascha. And of course, I'm sure Natascha would be happy to follow up if you wanted to get in contact about this research as well.